Why does everyone act like Harrison doesn't exist? Ethan asked quietly from the far end of the dining room table. And for the first time in 20 years, nobody in the Harrison family touched their wine. The chandelier above us hummed softly, casting warm gold light across the old oak table that had belonged to this family longer than most of us had been alive. Outside the tall windows, rain tapped against the glass in slow, uneven rhythms. But inside the dining room, the silence felt heavier than the storm. Harrison sat alone near the fireplace in his faded denim jacket, one rough hand resting beside an untouched glass of bourbon. He didn't look up when Ethan spoke. He just kept staring into the fire like he already knew this moment would come someday. Isabel recovered first. She lifted the silver wine bottle with elegant fingers and smiled the same polished smile she used whenever she wanted to bury tension before it reached the surface. "That's enough strange questions for tonight," she said softly while pouring wine into David's glass. David didn't answer. He looked exhausted, the dark circles beneath his eyes more noticeable under the chandelier light. Across the table, Eleanor adjusted the sleeve of her pastel cardigan without meeting anyone's gaze. Her hands trembled slightly. I noticed because they always trembled when Harrison was mentioned. Ethan leaned back in his chair slowly, studying the room with the sharp expression of someone finally noticing cracks in a wall everyone else pretended was solid. "I'm serious," he said. "Grandpa's photos are everywhere in this house. Great-grandfather too. But Harrison isn't in any of them. Not one." Near the staircase, James stood frozen beside the serving cart. Even Thomas, the family attorney, lowered his eyes toward the tablecloth. Nobody wanted to answer. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not anger, not denial. Fear. Harrison finally reached for his bourbon glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down again with quiet precision. The firelight reflected faintly across his weathered face, revealing old scars time hadn't fully erased. He still said nothing. Isabel gave a soft laugh that sounded rehearsed. "He worked on the estate for years," she replied. "That's all there is to tell." But Ethan kept staring at Harrison, and I could see it happening in real time. The moment curiosity became suspicion, because Harrison didn't look like a groundskeeper. He looked like a man who had spent years watching someone else live inside a life that once belonged to him. The dinner ended quietly after that, but the silence followed everyone out of the room like smoke clinging to expensive fabric. I watched Ethan linger near the staircase while the others disappeared into their usual corners of the estate. Isabel guided David upstairs with one hand resting lightly against his arm, whispering something into his ear that made his shoulders tighten even more. Eleanor remained seated beneath the chandelier long after everyone else had gone, staring at the untouched candles in the center of the table as if she had forgotten where she was. Harrison stood slowly near the fireplace and reached for his old work jacket. For a brief second, Thomas rose from his chair before Harrison even moved, the way people stand automatically for someone important without realizing they are doing it. The moment passed quickly, but Ethan noticed. I could tell by the look in his eyes. Harrison gave a small nod toward James before walking out through the side hallway that led toward the back of the estate. Nobody stopped him. Nobody ever did. The Harrison property sat on nearly 40 acres outside Newport, Rhode Island, surrounded by iron gates and old maple trees that had probably witnessed more secrets than the family itself. The main house looked beautiful from a distance, all stone columns and glowing windows, but inside, the place felt cold in ways money could not fix. Ethan found me in the library nearly an hour later. Rain slid slowly across the tall windows behind him while the grandfather clock ticked steadily near the shelves. "Something is wrong in this family," he said quietly. He was still young enough to sound shocked by that realization. I closed the book in my hands without answering. Ethan walked toward the old portrait wall beside the fireplace. Generations of Harrisons stared down from heavy gold frames. Politicians, bankers, men in military uniforms, women wearing pearls and stiff expressions. But there was an empty gap near the center of the arrangement where another portrait should have been. The wallpaper behind it looked lighter than the rest, untouched by sunlight. Ethan stepped closer. "There was a painting here." I said nothing. He turned toward me slowly. "Who did they remove?" Before I could answer, James appeared in the doorway carrying a silver tray with untouched coffee cups. His expression changed the moment he saw Ethan standing near the missing space on the wall. "You should get some sleep, sir," James said carefully. But Ethan kept staring at the empty spot between the portraits. That was Harrison's place, was it not? The tray trembled slightly in James's hands. And for the first time that night, somebody looked genuinely afraid. James left the library almost immediately after that, but the damage had already been done. Ethan stood alone beneath the portrait wall for several long seconds, staring at the pale rectangle where the missing painting used to hang. The rain outside had grown heavier now, the sound steady against the windows like fingertips tapping glass. Somewhere deeper in the house, a piano began playing softly, old jazz drifting through the hallway speakers. Isabel insisted on keeping active during dinners. The music should have made the estate feel warm. Instead, it made the silence stranger. Ethan reached toward the empty space on the wall, tracing the faded outline with his fingers. "Why would someone remove only one portrait?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered because nobody wanted to. The next morning, the estate looked almost peaceful beneath the gray Rhode Island sky. Fog rolled across the back gardens while James prepared coffee in the downstairs kitchen before sunrise. Harrison was already outside repairing one of the old iron fence posts near the eastern property line. He worked slowly, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold air, his silver hair uncombed beneath a worn canvas jacket. Ethan watched him through the kitchen window for nearly 5 minutes before speaking. "How long has he lived here?" James carefully placed another plate onto the tray. "Longer than most people realize." "That is not an answer." James finally looked at him then, his tired eyes filled with the kind of caution that only comes from years of protecting dangerous truths. "This family survived because certain questions were never asked." Ethan gave a quiet laugh. "And now?" James glanced toward the window where Harrison continued working alone near the fence line. "Now I think the house is getting tired of lying." Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into town and stopped at the Newport Historical Society, searching for archived photographs connected to the Harrison estate. He expected nothing. Instead, an elderly clerk disappeared into the records room and returned carrying a leather-bound archive book covered in dust. Ethan opened it slowly at one of the marked pages and immediately froze. There, in a black and white photograph dated October 1987, stood a much younger Harrison wearing a dark tailored suit beside the former head of the Harrison family during a charity gala held at the estate. Harrison did not stand in the background. He stood at the center. One arm rested confidently against the shoulder of Eleanor, who looked almost radiant beside him. The caption beneath the photograph made Ethan's stomach tighten. "Harrison Blackwood, eldest son of the Harrison estate." Ethan stared at the page for a very long time before whispering the words aloud again. Eldest son, not groundskeeper, not employee, son. And suddenly the missing portrait back at the mansion no longer felt like an accident. Ethan drove back to the estate just before sunset with the archive photograph resting carefully on the passenger seat beside him. The closer he got to Harrison Manor, the heavier the silence inside the car seemed to become. By the time the iron gates appeared through the fog, he already knew one thing with absolute certainty. Everyone inside that house had lied to him for years. The dining room glowed with soft amber light when he entered through the front hall. Dinner preparations had already begun again, as if the previous night had never happened. Crystal glasses lined the oak table with mathematical precision, while Isabel directed the staff near the fireplace in her calm, elegant voice. She looked perfectly composed in a cream silk blouse and dark slacks, every detail controlled down to the way she folded her napkin onto her lap. David sat near the end of the table staring blankly into a glass of scotch, while Eleanor remained unusually quiet beneath the chandelier. Harrison was not there. Ethan stepped into the room holding the archive photo in one hand. "I went to the Historical Society today," he said. The effect was immediate. Isabel stopped speaking. David slowly lifted his eyes. Even Eleanor's breathing seemed to pause. Ethan placed the black and white photograph onto the center of the table beside the candles. "Would someone like to explain why Harrison Blackwood is listed here as the eldest son of this family?" Nobody moved. The only sound came from logs shifting softly inside the fireplace. Isabel was the first to recover. She glanced briefly at the photograph before pouring herself another glass of wine. "Old records are not always accurate," she said smoothly. Ethan almost laughed at how quickly the lie arrived. "That photograph was taken here, in this house." David picked up the picture with visibly shaking hands. Ethan watched the confusion spread slowly across his face as he read the caption beneath the image. "This cannot be real," David whispered. But Eleanor finally closed her eyes as though she no longer had the strength to pretend. Across the room, James stood frozen beside the doorway, holding a silver serving tray against his chest. Ethan turned toward him sharply. "You knew?" James lowered his gaze without answering, and somehow that silence confirmed everything. Isabel leaned back calmly in her chair. "You are turning family history into a conspiracy because of one old photograph." But Ethan noticed something important then. Isabel never once denied Harrison was family. Not once. Before Ethan could speak again, a quiet voice came from the hallway behind them. "That is because she knows exactly who I am." Everyone turned toward the doorway at once. Harrison stood there in his worn denim jacket with rainwater still clinging to his sleeves, his expression unreadable beneath the dim hallway light. And for the first time since this began, he did not look like an outsider standing inside the Harrison estate. He looked like the only person in the room who truly belonged there. The room remained completely still after Harrison spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter somehow, the flames shifting softly behind the iron screen while rain continued tapping against the tall dining room windows. Harrison stepped inside slowly, removing his damp work gloves one finger at a time before placing them neatly beside the doorway. Nobody offered him a seat. Nobody needed to. He walked directly toward the far end of the oak table and sat down in the chair that had remained empty throughout dinner for as long as Ethan could remember. The moment he lowered himself into it, something invisible inside the room shifted. David noticed it too. Ethan could see the confusion spreading across his face, like someone realizing the floor beneath them had never been stable. Isabel remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. Harrison rested both hands calmly against the table. "You should not have involved the boy," he said quietly while looking toward Isabel. She gave a faint smile. Secrets rarely stay buried forever. Harrison looked toward Eleanor then, and the sadness in her expression seemed almost unbearable beneath the chandelier light. She looked older tonight than she had only 24 hours earlier. "How long?" Ethan finally asked. Harrison turned his attention toward him. "Long enough for everyone in this house to forget what honesty sounds like." David stood abruptly from his chair, the movement scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I want someone to explain what is happening." His voice cracked near the end of the sentence. Isabel reached for his arm immediately. "David, sit down." "No." He stepped away from her for the first time all evening. "You knew about this." Isabel said nothing, and that silence answered more than words could. Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, studying David with an unreadable expression. "You were never meant to carry this family alone," he said calmly. "That burden was handed to you by people protecting themselves." Ethan watched David's face pale beneath the dining room light. Years of pressure suddenly seemed to settle visibly across his shoulders all at once. Every business failure, every expectation, every impossible standard attached to the Harrison name. Isabel stood slowly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her blouse before speaking. "You are making ancient history sound dramatic because it suits you now." Harrison almost smiled at that. "No, Isabel. The dramatic part was erasing a man while forcing his shadow to maintain the estate from the outside." The words landed heavily across the room. Ethan looked toward James near the doorway and realized something disturbing then. James was not shocked by any of this. Neither was Thomas. The only people still confused were David and Ethan. Everyone else had been living beside the truth for years. Harrison reached into the inside pocket of his weathered jacket and removed a folded yellow document worn thin with age. He placed it gently onto the table beside the candles. "If the family wishes to continue pretending," he said quietly, "then burn that without reading it." Nobody moved. Nobody touched the document for nearly 10 seconds. The old paper rested beneath the chandelier light like something dangerous left in the middle of the table. Ethan could hear the grandfather clock ticking faintly somewhere beyond the dining room walls, each second stretching tighter across the silence. Finally, Thomas reached forward with slow, careful hands and unfolded the yellowed pages. The moment his eyes moved across the first paragraph, the color drained from his face. Isabel noticed immediately. "Thomas," she said calmly, "that document was resolved decades ago." Thomas did not answer her. He kept reading, his expression growing heavier with every line. David stepped closer. "What is it?" Thomas removed his glasses slowly before speaking. "This is the original succession amendment written by your grandfather in 1989. Ethan looked toward Harrison at once. Harrison remained completely still at the far end of the table, watching the room with the patience of someone who had already survived the worst part years ago. "Read it," Harrison said quietly. Thomas hesitated only briefly before continuing aloud. "To my eldest son, Harrison Blackwood Harrison, I leave controlling authority over the estate, financial trusts, and future family holdings." David stared at him in disbelief. "That is impossible." Thomas looked down again. "Any later amendment removing Harrison Blackwood Harrison shall require direct written consent from both sons." The room went silent once more. Ethan frowned. "Both sons?" Eleanor suddenly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Isabel closed her eyes briefly as though she had finally run out of ways to stop what was happening. David turned slowly toward Eleanor. "Mother." She could not look at him. Harrison spoke before she could answer. "You had a brother." David stepped backward as though the floor itself had shifted beneath him. "No," his voice sounded hollow now. "I would know that." Harrison lowered his gaze toward the table. "He died when he was 6 years old." Even the fire seemed quieter after that. Ethan watched Eleanor break completely beneath the weight of memory she had spent decades carrying alone. Tears slipped silently down her face while her hands shook against the edge of the tablecloth. "Victoria blamed me," she whispered. "After the accident, she blamed me for everything." Ethan felt cold despite the warmth of the fireplace. Harrison finally looked directly at David. "Your grandfather changed after the funeral." Victoria convinced him grief needed someone to punish. Isabel stepped away from the table toward the windows, her reflection faint against the dark glass outside. "The estate was collapsing financially back then," she said quietly. "The family needed stability." Harrison almost smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "No, the family needed someone easier to erase." Thomas carefully turned the final page of the document, and this time his voice sounded unsteady even to himself. "There is one more clause." Every eye in the room shifted toward him. Thomas swallowed once before reading aloud. "If evidence of coercion or concealment is ever proven, ownership of the Harrison estate immediately reverts to Harrison Blackwood Harrison alone." No one spoke after Thomas finished reading the final clause. The entire dining room seemed frozen beneath the chandelier light, while rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking the dark gardens outside. David slowly lowered himself back into his chair, staring blankly at the document as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating if he waited long enough. Isabel remained near the windows with one arm folded tightly across her waist, her reflection sharp against the glass. For the first time since Ethan had known her, she looked uncertain. Harrison sat quietly at the far end of the table with both hands resting calmly beside his untouched bourbon. He did not look victorious. That was the unsettling part. He looked tired. Eleanor finally stood from her chair with visible effort. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered. Her voice trembled softly beneath the silence surrounding the room. David looked toward her immediately. "Mother, tell me the truth." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment before speaking again. "Your grandfather rewrote everything after William died." Ethan frowned slightly. "William was the brother?" She nodded. "Harrison tried to stop the changes. He fought with Victoria for months after the funeral." Harrison gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "That is a polite way to describe it." Eleanor turned toward him with tears still lingering in her eyes. "You disappeared before I could fix any of it." Harrison looked into the fire rather than at her. "No, I left because there was nothing left to save." The words settled heavily across the room. Ethan glanced toward David and realized something painful then. David had spent his entire life trying to become worthy of a legacy that was never fully his to carry. Every business deal, every impossible expectation, every cold dinner beneath this chandelier. He had inherited pressure instead of truth. Thomas carefully folded the succession document again and placed it back onto the table. "There is another issue," he said quietly. Isabel looked toward him sharply. "What issue?" Thomas adjusted his glasses slowly. "If Harrison chooses to challenge the amended trust in court, there is enough evidence here to reopen the original estate proceedings." Isabel stepped away from the window immediately. That would destroy this family publicly. Harrison finally looked at her directly. This family was destroyed 30 years ago. The room fell silent again. Ethan noticed James lowering his eyes near the doorway as though he had waited decades to hear someone finally say those words aloud. David rubbed both hands across his face before speaking in a voice that barely sounded like his own. "Why did nobody tell me?" Eleanor answered first. "Because children raised inside old money are taught very early which truths are acceptable and which truths disappear." Outside, thunder rolled softly over the estate grounds. Harrison stood slowly from his chair and reached for his weathered jacket. "Get some sleep," he said calmly toward David. "Tomorrow this house will start pretending nothing happened." Ethan watched Harrison walk toward the hallway leading deeper into the estate, but before disappearing into the shadows, Harrison paused near the doorway without turning around. "The problem," he said quietly, "is that I stopped pretending years ago." The house did exactly what Harrison predicted the next morning. It pretended. Sunlight poured through the tall east windows of the estate as though nothing had changed overnight. Fresh flowers appeared in silver vases along the hallway tables. Staff moved quietly through the dining room preparing breakfast with the same mechanical precision they had followed for years. Somewhere upstairs, classical music drifted softly from the second-floor sitting room. Harrison Manor had always been very good at disguising decay beneath beauty. Ethan barely slept. By 7:30 in the morning, he was already standing in the library searching through old financial ledgers while cold coffee sat untouched beside him. The more records he opened, the stranger the timeline became. Harrison's name vanished completely from estate. Documents after 1990. No death certificate. No legal separation. No buyout agreement. It was as if the family had simply erased him from existence and expected history to cooperate. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia stepped into the library carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. She looked composed in a dark navy coat despite the storm clouds gathering again outside. "Thomas called me early this morning," she said softly. "He thought you might need help understanding what you found." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Did you know about Harrison?" Sophia shook her head. "Not until last night. But I did know the trust structure around this estate never made legal sense." She placed several copied documents across the desk beneath the green reading lamp. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "What is this?" "Property transfer records," Sophia answered. "And somebody altered them years ago." Ethan stared at the signatures lining the pages. One name appeared repeatedly beside every amended filing. Victoria Harrison. The same woman Eleanor claimed had controlled the family after William's death. Ethan sat back slowly. "She built the entire estate around a lie." "No," Sophia replied carefully. "She built it around fear." Outside the library windows, thunder rolled across the distant coastline while rain darkened the gardens once again. Ethan glanced toward the hallway. "Where is Harrison?" Sophia hesitated briefly before answering. "James said he left before sunrise." Something about that unsettled Ethan more than he expected. Harrison had spent decades living quietly inside the shadows of this estate. But now that the truth had finally surfaced, he was nowhere to be found. Ethan walked toward the portrait wall near the fireplace again, staring at the empty space where Harrison's painting once hung. "Why stay here all these years?" he whispered. Sophia stepped beside him. Maybe because leaving completely would have made the lie permanent. Before Ethan could answer, raised voices echoed faintly from the main hallway outside the library. "Isabel." "David." The tension in David's voice sounded sharper now than Ethan had ever heard before. Sophia looked toward the doorway immediately. "Something is happening." Ethan stepped into the corridor just as David's words carried through the estate. "You knew the entire time and still let me inherit this mess." Isabel stood near the staircase beneath the chandelier with perfect posture despite the anger aimed directly at her. "I protected this family." David laughed bitterly. "No, you protected the version that benefited you." And for the first time in years, the silence inside Harrison Manor no longer belonged to Harrison alone.